The next discussion is based around the provocative question, are screens making young people sad and anxious? And we've got a stellar panel to discuss this. What I want to do was just introduce them one at a time, get them to come on stage. The first panel member and the person who's going to be facilitating the discussion is Associate Professor Bridie O'Day. She's one of the rising star researchers at the Black Dog Institute. She's our digital cross-cutting theme lead and has led a number of the really key studies about the intersection between young people's mental health and digital technologies. Bridie, come on up. Thank you. Yeah, I should have got you to sit under your picture, shouldn't I? That would make everyone's life... But wait, that screen's going to change, so don't worry. So the next panel member is Angela Falkenberg, and she is the president of the Australian Primary Principals... Australia? Is it an association? Association of Australia. So that's overseeing over 7,000 schools. She herself has been a principal at 3 schools. And somehow, in amongst being a principal at 3 schools and other leadership positions, you did a healthcare project around neonatal nurseries. Okay. Next, we have Aston Hawkins-Nichols. They are a UNICEF Australia Young Ambassador, and that role focuses around digital safety and championing a safer digital world for all. Proudly embrace their Aboriginal heritage, neurodiversity. It's got here, neurospicy, as the cool kids say. I don't know if I was meant to read that out or not. Anyway, Aston's life and journey, enriched by that diverse experience, equips them with a unique perspective in their advocacy work. Aston, thank you. And then we have Jocelyn Brewer, who's a Sydney-based psychologist with a special interest in psychology and technology and, as she says, staying human in a digitally saturated age. She created Digital Nutrition 10 years ago now, which is a positive framework for digital wellbeing issues. And in 2021 completed her Masters in Cyber Psychology at Sydney Uni. So Sydney Uni to have a Masters in Cyber Psychology, isn't it? Anyway, we'll move on. So good news, I'm going to leave the stage now. I'm going to leave you in Bridie's hands to have this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, for all those wonderful introductions. Okay, so to get us started today, we're really asking the question, and we're here to answer this question, is are screens making our young people sad and anxious? And I wanted to put up the first key points out of that discussion paper that you have in front of you. So you should or hopefully all aware that this topic is very big in the media. It's one that gets talked about a lot in schools and in families and by young people. And so we know that on average, teenagers are spending about 30 hours a week on their screens, which is around 5 hours a day. And we know that this has emerged as a concerning problem in parents, families and schools. But we also know alongside of that mental health problems are increasing. We know that through the Mission Australia survey that we've seen the rates of psychological distress increase over time, and we know through our white paper last year a rising tide of depression in Australia, which outlines a lot of the research from Australia around the rates of anxiety and depression increasing. And we know that technology use is often blamed as a key driver of why we see these rates increasing. And in fact, our own research through the Future Proofing study done across 6,500 young people across Australia has shown a small correlation between screen time and young people's mental health. So today our panel is going to be here to discuss some of the things that they've seen and learned in their own experience working with young people and what they really think the focus should be on in this domain. So we do have a Slido question that if you want to scan it in, well, I'll leave that up there while you can... Everyone's got that. Great. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, do you agree or disagree that the mobile phone ban in both primary and secondary schools is beneficial for young people's mental health? So, for those of you who are aware, the New South Wales government recently followed many other states and introduced a ban of mobile phones in secondary schools, which was followed by the recent ban that we've already seen of mobile phones in primary schools. And this has been something that's been discussed in the media a lot recently, and we're very keen to hear your thoughts on whether or not you think this policy decision was the right one. So we can see there already we're getting a overwhelming, well, we wouldn't really call that overwhelming, would we? That's media talk. We have some people agreeing. And not as much in the neutral, actually. We're getting definitely a lot more in agree. So we might just leave it there and we'll come back to this and we'll talk. But I think we can basically take from that we are seeing in the audience today a general agreement that this mobile phone ban was the right thing to do. And that's very interesting coming from my position as a researcher in this space. But we're not here to hear from me. And so the first question that we have for our panel today, and we have great representation from young people, schools, and the mental health industry, is do you think that screen time is more harmful or more beneficial for young people's mental health? Who would like to jump in first?
I'll go for it. Look, I am always a fence sitter. I get splinters in my bum from this. I think we have to ask the question around who's driving the technology. So a Corolla being driven by a P-plater who's learning the skills on the road with their seatbelt on, very different to a young person, unlicensed, no seatbelt in a Ferrari. And this is where I guess the nuance of the questions is really, really important to me as somebody who was in schools in New South Wales for 19 years who's done research around this. So there are positives, we know that. There are also negatives that come from not having the lessons to know how to drive this incredible technology in a way that is, I guess, aligned to where their brain development is at and what we know about young people themselves, identity formation, all of the social aspects of being an adolescent.
Yeah, absolutely. And we often hear in this debate, a lot of the focus tends to be on adolescents. And so, Angela, with your experience working in primary schools, there's been the ban in primary schools for a lot longer than we've seen in high schools. And how have you seen that play out?
I can say it's actually assisted my mental health because I wasn't sitting in meetings that were really uncomfortable with, children whose brains were leading them to make really poor decisions. I was sharing with someone at morning tea, because I've checked with a few colleagues last week, and, we've got young people who understand the power of social media but not necessarily make good decisions about it. And a current little thing is GKY, go kill yourself. Kids are texting to each other as a response to something they don't like. Now, an 8-year-old probably doesn't really understand the impact. So I absolutely agree, it depends. They can be of great assistance. We certainly use screens in primary school for intervention strategies, but it is about how much supervision for the developing brain. And it bothers me that I see prams with iPad holders on them. It really bothers me that I saw recently when I visited the Sydney Zoo with my own grandbaby, a child at the zoo staring at the iPad and not the animals. So for me, the bigger question is how does it happen? And adults are clearly part of this.
Yeah, and that's one thing around the discussion. We often see it focused on young people's mental health around things like self-esteem, and then with young people it's around concentration and attention. But Aston, you're a young person, you have a lot of friends, you've talked to me a little bit about their experiences with technology, and what do you think are some of the harms and benefits?
Personally, I feel that some of the main harms that come out of, using your screen time, okay, sorry, I'm going to restart. So I think I need to address the elephant in the room with what's happened recently, which is the referendum, and how that's impacted a lot of children and young people it's hard not to talk about it because that's the only thing that's on my mind at the moment. And really, you know, with situations like this, it's shown the rest of the nation what we experience on an everyday basis. And of course, it's been heightened because of what's been happening. But when we're using our phones, this is what we're seeing: a lot of really horrible stuff. We're being subjected to racism. Our identities are being heavily politicized and scrutinized and dehumanized in the media, social media. And I think it's really unfair that, you know, we're not having a voice in when policy is being designed to support us through this, because without young people and children having a say on issues that impact them, how are you going to design something that's for us? And I also want to say that it has been a beautiful thing as well. I don't want to say that it's been all bad, because growing up, it was a way for me to find my community, my people. I was able to find, you know, as a queer person as well, I was able to find people that understood me and where I felt safe, because I didn't have that in the physical world.
Yeah, and we talked a lot about that in the preparation for this panel, and how that being online is a really great way, particularly when you're a young person and going through your identity and building your identity, to connect with people with common interests, and it can really help you feel like you belong. But we've also found, as an increasingly global world, that the young people are starting to be exposed to more harmful content. And it's often not by choice. We know that with the tech companies, they have algorithms that often give you content. And so that's one of the things I wanted to hear your thoughts on, is that, you know, where do you feel the responsibility lies when it comes to protecting young people's mental health when they're online? Is this something you feel is the young person's responsibility, or does it go broader than that? You know, parents, governments, and even the tech companies themselves?
But all of the above. You know, I think that accountability needs to be there for big tech and government to ensure that it is a safe place for children and young people, especially since, you know, a lot of us are guinea pigs for this. I'm Gen Z, so I grew up online, and I didn't know what I was getting myself into, and neither did my parents. So how could they have possibly prepared? I think that education also needs to be there for parents as well, because, you know, for a while there, I felt a bit of resentment that my parents weren't able to support me through that, but they didn't know any better, because this was the first time that they were being exposed to it as well.
Yeah, and Jocelyn, you were saying that you know, you've worked a lot in schools previously around digital nutrition and using the analogy towards food. And so, did you want to share some of your experience around how that has been in terms of rolling out information programs in schools?
Yeah, so as a mum of a 6-year-old, even with everything that I know, I still am in this massive experiment where we're making up our own rules and really talking through how we curate a digital diet that is sort of really attuned to the best bits, and we're avoiding some of those pitfalls. Within schools, I think a lot of the conversation has been directed to e-safety and preventing cyberbullying, which it needs to be, but digital wellbeing is quite a separate, I guess, area around those healthy screen habits. And because, you know, we like to talk about digital natives, I like to call them digital orphans. They actually kind of, you know, are coming through without that older generation of people with the skills to be able to effectively, based on evidence, work out how to manage this stuff. It is a shoulder-to-shoulder conversation. Me and my 6-year-old are working it out together. I encourage parents, and I run courses for parents, to actually design tech use agreements, not contracts, not rules, not, you know, enforcement, around how do we want technology to show up in our lives? What are you know, the guidelines and the guardrails that we need to have in place? Schools is a tricky kind of area, because I've actually stopped doing presentations in high schools, because I don't think sitting on the floor in a hall with 120 kids and me trying to work really hard to get them to think about, You know, not being on TikTok for 6 hours at a time is an effective way of learning, and I can't actually map the impact of that work. So I've pulled back from doing some of that work purely because I can't check what that impact is, and I don't think it's necessarily the best way to go about it. There's a lot of other great work happening though. Lots of different organisations. Project Rocket comes to mind with their In Real Life project, which is youth-led, youth-designed, as some of the models that I think are really beneficial for that older group. Again, younger kids, there's a whole range of resources out there, and the conversation really needs to start in preschool.
Yeah, and Angela, when we were preparing for this, you also talked about it, and I've got 2 young children, and this resonated with me, that you're using technology to soothe them and to amuse them. And I think, you know, as similar to the parents at the zoo, a lot of parents' default is using that device. And so in terms of working in primary schools, how do you think those early technology patterns then sort of play out as these young people or children turn to school?
Look, it's an easy distraction for a child. You just hand them the phone, put on whether it's Wiggles, whether it's, you know, a game. But there are other ways to soothe and distract as well. Parents seem to be unable to tolerate their child's boredom at times. And we know that sometimes in boredom and in that space, creative thinking happens, whether it's plotting against your parents or coming up with something. But we seem to have an inability to manage discomfort. And so I say to parents, it's okay that your child's bored. You know, tell them to find 5 red things when they're looking there, or is it Lego? Or, radical, give them a book. Like, you know, books are easy. Children who don't have screens will happily read a book. So I think we too quickly go to it as self-soothing, and then it becomes a dependency. So I do have children who are 5 and start school, and the parents ask where can their iPad be stored, which they'll need to use to, you know, self-regulate. And we think, how did this happen? They're 5.
And Aston, is that something that you've experienced or seen, you know, other ways, you know, putting technology down? And, you know, it may not have been a book, but what other activities have you found that have been helpful for balancing out your screen time use?
Getting out in nature, really just finding any way to ground myself. It is hard because a lot of our social connections happen online, and if we're going to try and challenge this and you know, look at adapting, then we also need to navigate how we relearn some of the maybe the lost social skills, and how does that work? What does that look like? And I think that, again, it needs to be informed by children and young people, and especially, you know, that inclusion of people from diverse backgrounds is really important. And I see a future where we can coexist with technology, but at the moment it's very all-consuming, and it's either all or nothing kind of attitudes. And I think we can do better, but got a ways to go.
It's so multidisciplinary as well. I was originally a geographer, so from my perspective, seeing all of the high-rise going up in Sydney, where are the outdoor spaces? Where are the basketball courts? Where's the community centres that are funded with things to do? We just don't have that. I've worked with schools in New Zealand that banned phones, but they built BMX tracks, they built climbing walls, and everyone was then up in arms about kids' physical safety. We don't want to break an arm, you know, those kinds of things that we have really put different attention on our physical safety and being careful. Meanwhile, in digital spaces, there are a lot more risks, psychological risks to all of us at any moment that we pick up and dive into some of that slipstream of information.
And is that actually anything, Angela, you saw that when they did bring in the primary school ban, was there any action to replace the phone or what the phone meant to students, or did you find that being younger it wasn't as significant issue as the high schools faced?
Look, often when younger children had phones, it was actually about parents' anxiety and wanting to know where their child was and that they could contact them. We used to wonder why young children had smartphones and not a dumb phone. You know, if the purpose was contact, that would be enough. Really, it was quite easy, particularly in our more low SES communities. Personal phone use wasn't as high. It was more our affluent communities where parents had bought them the phone. And I can remember coming to Canberra in 2018, I think, was 60 year 7s and 58 had a phone and 2 didn't. One because he forgot it and the other because he preferred books. Love that child.
His spirit
So
child.
yeah, it was quite an easy thing, but it was more parent anxiety. How could I contact my child? They're at school, they're safe, it's okay.
And we often hear about that a lot in the school space, that it's a projection and extension of some of the things that the parents are experiencing. So we know that there have been a lot of initiatives to tackle screen time in youth, from policy like mobile phone bans to school-based programs. We've also seen technology devices, so things like warnings and alerts and monitoring your time. But from your 3 experience, we're really keen to learn what you think is working, or what would you like to see be happening in this space?
Who wants to go, Jocelyn?
Yes.
Look, with the phone ban thing, I think that's kind of like building a higher pool fence. Of course, we need to have some safety around that, but if you're not checking that the latch to the pool fence is actually working, there's going to be kids who are getting around that. And we're not teaching those digital swimming lessons. As you can probably tell, I like an analogy. So those digital swimming lessons are not just for the pool, they're for the unfenceable internet that they go home to. So while obviously we want to protect young people's attention, we want to give them the attention management skills to be able to, you know, really develop their higher order thinking, we also need to teach them those skills that not only prepare them for the future, but are actually social emotional skills. They're, you know, what we see in the Australian curriculum in critical and creative thinking and the personal and social capability. So I would just like more investment into doing the tough stuff, which is developing the human and this technology, the most complex technology on the planet that's under our skull, into being able to learn to, you know, navigate these spaces, because we haven't seen anything yet. We're going to talk about AI this afternoon. That immersive technology that's coming down the line is, you know, really going to change the game again, and we are not thinking about that. We've just upped that pool fence. Yeah.
Aston, do you have any thoughts on that one?
I think there's a massive disconnect between what children and young people, from my experience of, you know, talking to children and young people about this issue, there's a massive disconnect between what they're thinking and feeling in comparison to the way that adults are perceiving it. And, you know, part of that is making sure that that communication is there to understand why policies have been made and implemented, but then also was there consultation in that process with children and young people to be able to actually create something that was really fair. Because I work with the Commissioner for Children and Young People in South Australia on Ghana country, and every year there's the inaugural SASRC Summit, which is an opportunity for children and young people from all across the state, to come out and collaborate together to work on issues that are important to them. And in these conversations, I've heard a lot about the phone bans that were implemented and some of the harsh measures that they felt were really unfair, and they don't believe that this is the way forward. With the way that it is now, there's got to be something better. And I think the only way that you'll be able to find the solution is by talking to young people and children.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting you say that, because when I was doing my PhD, actually, one of the areas of my PhD was looking at defining cyberbullying, because this was back in 2009 and it was really emerging. And we actually asked parents and young people to rate experiences on the internet and whether that would be defined by them as cyberbullying. And interestingly, none of the instances that parents said were cyberbullying were what the children thought was cyberbullying. And so I think that speaks around with screen time, what we think is harmful and what we perceive to be negative as adults is actually not necessarily always aligned with what the young person thinks themselves. Angela, you in the primary school space, the ban's been there for a long time. What would you like to see now?
Look, I would like to see, right in the first 1,000 days of life, that we have this included as part of education. I don't know, the causal relationships, the research is still out there, but I would like parents to be thinking about screen use and making decisions in the same way they think about putting sunblock on when their child goes outside, or a child restraint in a car. You know, you've got this this screen which you're building some habits which may or may not be useful. So getting people to think, those first 1,000 days, we know how critical they are to the life course of a child, and if it could be enhanced through something or decreased through something, can we make good decisions? And I think, and as the research comes out, how do we keep that? There's Australian Children in the Media. I know there's the Raising or Parenting Network has really good stuff. Keep it going, but we also need to get parents to be reading it.
Yeah, and I think there's an emergence around the world internationally that we have really failed to recognise that the phone is a device which is, as a device, addictive. And we can see in the EU there's increased regulations around how apps can be designed, that they are designed in ways like slot machines, and that they're actually looking in the EU to ban certain design features. So from a policy level, it's going to be very interesting watching that space and how that might apply here in Australia.
Can I add one other thing?
Absolutely.
I would love that if the issue, cyberbullying or whatever, happens outside of school, that it's dealt with out of school. That would be, for me, a golden issue. The number of incidents that come into the schoolyard that schools and teachers are spending time on, and therefore they're not spending time on other things. I'd love it. If someone can make that happen, I will make a statue of them.
And I think that's one of the challenges that we have with the digital, because it's allowed worlds to merge. You're able to connect across time and space with technology, and that's something that schools certainly grapple with, because we know what happens outside the gates has a big impact inside the gates. So we're going to now go to the floor for some questions. Before I start with the ones that are online, is there anyone? Yep, we have a few. There we go.
It's a very nuanced idea, isn't it? And there's a few things I've picked up on, digital swimming lessons being one of them. And I think it's really interesting. I had my children right after MySpace and Facebook came out. And I was newly diagnosed with bipolar type 2, and the amount of online bullying I experienced then was insane. So I started, and I'm quite well educated, so I started talking with my children really young to, I suppose, encourage the human side of that. And I don't think banning phones is the answer. How do we teach our children from a young age to engage? Now, being a Canberra person that's experienced with mental illness and has experienced cyberbullying, how do we lift the capability across Australia, across all diverse backgrounds, in the parenting groups, so that those conversations are happening outside of school? And how do we hold children accountable without judging them? My children still make mistakes, but they've been part of the conversation. So how do we enable parents, and how do we hold children accountable for behaviour without making them think they're bad people?
Yeah, I think I don't have the perfect answer for your question, but in terms of holding kids accountable in a non-judgmental way, I don't know. That's a really difficult one to navigate, because it depends who you are. Like, when you're talking about the type, like, if you're someone who's subjected to discrimination in all its forms, then you're more likely to be cyberbullied online. You're more likely to experience negative experiences online, and so it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And there needs to be different conversations across different communities across the continent.
Yeah, and we know in the research, that adolescence is we've all been through it, and it's a period of significant mistakes. It is that playground of where you do things that you often regret. And we know that a lot of young people who engage in bullying behaviour go on to deeply regret that behaviour as they become an adult. And as Aston, we were talking about in terms of being exposed to really harmful content and around is there a place there for strengths-based and values-based approaches where we're really trying to help a young person identify who do they want to be and what are their values, rather than this is the right way to behave and this is the wrong way to behave and you shouldn't do this. So I think there's a place there for psychological therapy and taking those learnings there and really trying to enrich that sense of identity in that person.
And I guess for parents, it's just about making parent education a bit more sexy, a bit more interesting, because it's really hard. The presentations I do, you preach to the choir or sing to the choir and the converted and whatever that saying is, that it's the parents who don't show up to parent-teacher interviews. It's the parents who are working 3 jobs, who live far from the school, that we need to reach out to be able to have those conversations. And also just to kind of take that guilt and shame away. I mean, new research shows that managing screen time mostly falls to mothers, and that adds to our mental load. So having more conversations that the struggle and the confusion and how do you do this, that's just a part of that vulnerability that we need to kind of, that actually builds our connections in our communities to be able to have. No one, I don't think, sets out to like screw up their kid and parent badly. We're all doing the best that we can, and we need to just kind of more conversations about, get that information, have more conversations earlier, and that builds our own habits of having those tricky conversations. Like, my kid said to me on Sunday morning, "Mum, do we have to take our yes sign down and put a no sign up now?" So how do we have those conversations? I mean, I cried and I said, yeah, like, let's talk about that. No, absolutely we don't. But they're the, like, out of the mouths of babes. How do we take that through and just add a digital lens? I think we get scared about the digital, like more stuff's happening. It's just like a lens that we see the world through.
And Angela, when you're talking to the students themselves, like how have you found those conversations or, engaging with them, talking to them when they're so little and so young?
Look, most, children do have a sense of fairness. They understand when you can talk about, we've talked about empathy today and compassion. Children can actually accept that. What I have seen I've been 40 years as an educator. What I've seen as the biggest change is parents' inability to accept their child's mistake. They'll defend it, try to blame others. I'm astounded by it. I've had children who've gone, yeah, I stuffed up, because they get that we're not into defining their whole future by that mistake. But I've had parents unwilling to accept it. And so I love that you're talking to your children about it. That is the most proactive strategy, is for a child to be really clear about the values of the family that we do, or, what we accept. Because the only person we really have control over is ourselves. And that's what we want children to understand. And their social groups are often kids with values similar to them. So building that up to have those conversations and say, it's a celebration of failure zone, because otherwise you don't become a Lego master, apparently. You've got to make lots of mistakes early on. That's what we want to have for our kids, is that it's just a point in time, that we're not going to repeat that point.
Aston, we talked a little bit about how one of the things that always surprises me around the screen time discussion, and we get a lot of media requests, is that there's very rarely any inclusion of the young person's voice, of the student's voice. And I find that quite interesting, because really it is the young person who it impacts. And we have a lot of questions coming through, particularly about that, in terms of having young people's control, and it taps into that co-creation of content. So Aston, how old were you, do you think it was, when you first realised that your technology use through screen time may have been negatively impacting your mental health? That's come from here, and you don't have to talk about that specifically if you don't want to, but the question is really tapping into, how do we really engage with the young person to learn from their experiences and to use that to guide our decision making?
So in my experience, I was cyberbullied from the age of 11, pretty much all the way through to, I would say, 18.
Yeah.
And that became a very common thing, and I think a lot of young people can relate.
Yeah.
When you're from any marginalized background, or if you're just different, the world sees you differently, and of course there's that's improving, but is it? In a lot of spaces, I think there needs to be a lot of work done. But yeah, to answer your question, I've been the day that I realized that it was really impacting me, I remember I was 16, and I was like, I had a moment where I realized I can't do this anymore, and my response to that was just putting my phone down altogether for about, I would say, 6 months. And that was, not that's not going to work for everyone, and of course that's not the ideal situation, and that was something that was able to do back then. It's different nowadays. But you know, like, to have that such a strong response at that age, because it was so negatively impacting me, is just really sad. And I know that a lot of people right now are taking a break from social media because of what's been happening, and just I hope that people can really understand that it's so important to hear what young people and children are saying about this, because at the end of the day, the policies that you design are going to impact us, and you know, particularly when it comes to children, that there needs to be that empowering of their voices to be heard.
Yeah, and what we can hear there is that young people also know their limits, and that when given the right tools and in the right situations and circumstances, they can actually ignite their own powers and put in those boundaries. And the research has actually supported taking breaks from certain technology use at certain times in your life. So they know that there are certain stressful events like relationship breakdowns where the research actually shows that disengaging from technology is actually the best and right decision there.
Yeah, and just talking to a diverse group of young people too, I really like to work with the kids who are most likely to break the phone ban, because they're the ones who are going to tell you the reasons and those underlying psychological kind of needs that they have to actually be on their phones. So working not just with, I guess, the good kids who show up and do some of that stuff, but getting into those larrikins could be really useful too, I find.
And I take your point before, Jocelyn, when we were saying if they're not doing that though, what are they going to do? Because if it has been a distraction or amusement or a soothing strategy. And it just reminded me, my local library has a Pac-Man game in there. And when I've been going in, I'm seeing young girls grouped around playing Pac-Man, you know, and I thought, wow, there's not a phone in sight, they're doing this. So, you know, what's the role in libraries and I guess local council areas to provide alternative activities, you know, to kids who do want to have what Tiffany Schlein in the US calls a tech Shabbat, a break.
Yeah, and we have a really important question here from Sophie Potter. And the question here, and this is something that I've often been interested in as well, is that do we feel this constant focus on screen time, both, you know, in the media, in schools? Do we feel that this is really diverting attention away from the really important issues for young people, such as things like climate change, discrimination, isolation, trauma? You know, do we feel it's a distraction and it's getting in the way of really what can help young people?
I think both things can be true. It can both be a distraction and also a resource for learning. And I know that in terms of, you know, elevating social movements in recent times, social media has played a critical role in that. And it's also played a very damaging role in terms of misinformation. And it's really, I think, going forward, you're talking about it before, AI, we have no idea what that means for us. And at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we're prepared, like, to be able to have critical thinking. You know, that really needs to be taught in schools when we're looking at the way that we're going to be able to respond to the changes. We have to ensure that we're actually prepared for them, and in the ways of like soft skills. I don't know if that's the words that you use. But yeah, just being able to, you know, see something online and be like, okay, I actually don't think that that's right. I'm going to fact check it. That kind of attitude and culture really needs to be encouraged, because there's so much misinformation.
Active consumer rather than just let it wash over you. Take some more proactiveness in the information you're consuming, and we absolutely know that that's a real problem on social media.
And I just think the whole conceptualisation of screen time still as this metric of time is really problematic, and there's a group of people who just want to focus on that. We know that it's more like your screenome, like your genome, the different ways that you interact with technology, and thinking beyond that time online to the content and the context that you're using it. So what are the virtual vitamins that might be in what you're doing? The educational benefits and the different nuances within that, I guess, is where that nutrition analogy comes from. There is tons of digital junk food and candy floss out there, and it's really being able to notice how much of that fits into that diet in a way that we can still then activate and use social media to arrange climate strikes on Fridays that kids will get in trouble for going to, and all of those, impounding issues.
So I wanted to just delve into a little bit more about this role of parents. Both our living cultural communities have shown us over many, many years this connection to our family and to our parents is very important in adolescence. And so I'm going to combine two questions here because, what they're asking is around how do we really help parents to have really good conversations with their children, but also model the right behaviour when parents themselves use their phone device or their screens to self-soothe and amuse.
I run a whole course on it, and it is values-led. It's a strengths-based conversation that starts with young people having permission to talk to their parents and call out what they see. My 6-year-old will tell me, "Mum, you're on your phone again," and I'll go, "Whoop, okay." And we have to be vulnerable to that and open to the coaching of young people rather than saying, "Do as I do, not do as I say, not do as I do," or whatever my dad used to tell me. I think the whole notion of parenting has changed, and as a parent, I only know about parenting based on what happened in the 80s. So that's an outdated model, and again, like parent education, it's not very sexy. We've really kind of do a lot of work around that, and even the notion of digital citizenship, I think, needs a massive rebrand, because it's not just media literacy or digital wellbeing or cyberbullying. It's all of how we live, love, and learn in this online space. That is, yeah.
And so, Angela, if you were to go up to that parent in the zoo with their iPhone, how do you think you would start that conversation?
Oh, look, I was thinking like Kitty Flanagan. If you remember, she was saying she was sick of having to walk out of the way of people on the footpath who were obsessed with their phones, so she's going to slap it out their hands.
Radical.
I'm thinking Kitty Flanagan. Do you know, again, if it was in my schoolyard, I would be saying, "Wow, look at this amazing bird over here," or something. I'd be actually pointing at that and then saying, "Tell me what's going on here," because sometimes it is, they've had a little meltdown and this is good, but it's that dependency piece. And I think, screen time is a useful conversation to actually understand, if I'm doing that, what else could I be doing? Or how do I reflect as a parent when I give my child the phone to distract? What's going on here? Is it about them or me? And because I keep going back to younger children. It's a quick fix for me, but I'm potentially creating an addiction here. But I wonder what else in that moment I could have done. And so I think about that preparation. My sister had a handbag. She was like Mary Poppins. And when we went out for dinner, even when her kids were adults, out of this bag would come rubber bands and paper clips, the longest chain you could make. She was amazing at what she could do with a bit of junk to amuse children. And she's never owned a mobile phone, doesn't understand why you'd want one. But I just think about, it's a quick fix. What else could we do? What might we be prepared to do?
Yeah, sounds like my parents, they just didn't take us out to dinner. So they didn't, yes. We didn't go to dinners or cafes.
Except to the local Chinese twice a year for something really fancy.
Yeah, and that's one thing I think, as you touched on, around having alternative strategies, because I certainly know that when I'm doing my shopping and my child is throwing a tantrum, that I just say, "Here you go, watch Trucks and Diggers." And so I think having those extra strategies, knowing what you can do in that moment. So I guess just on a last question to end up, someone from the audience has asked around, what support do you think is helpful for families who are trying to break very entrenched negative patterns of screen time? And what have you seen from your own experience that has worked and that you would offer as advice to these families?
I think a big part of it is removing the shame from these conversations. And, you know, when it comes to using your phone too much, like, I think that there's very much at this point in time a lot of shame attached to that. So I believe that kind of, you know, that attitude towards it makes it us more vulnerable to continue using it, because we're like, oh, well, you know, I'm already, like, I guess I'm just inherently bad.
Yep.
So I
I'm
may
stuck
as well,
here.
Yeah,
Yep.
I'm stuck here. This is what it is. And a lot of the time people feel uncomfortable about these conversations, especially when you're, you know, some families, you can't call out your parent
Yeah.
for, you know, if they're using their phone too much. And yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, there is a lot of individualisation and blame around bad technology use.
Yeah, in my clinical practice, I work with game-addicted kids and families who are really struggling with that. There are no tertiary treatment centres. There are some adult rehab clinics that sometimes, if you have the money, you can go to. I would love to set up, you know, some of the sport and rec camps around New South Wales and use those to actually do outdoor ed and to really use a circuit breaker. I don't think digital detox is the way to go per se, especially if that young person's entire life revolves around their online community, the competence they have in their gaming worlds. It is super complex. There is no funding. I know that there are lots of calls for that, but it is incredibly difficult for families where there really is, you know, young people not leaving their rooms for months on end. Certainly the school refusal that we saw and school anxiety and avoidance that has come out of post-pandemic lockdowns, huge numbers. I mean, we're estimating probably 3 to 5% of the population are pathologically addicted to games. And so you can do the maths that that's, you know, tens of thousands of young people across Australia.
Look, some of the families, you know, and again, we're talking primary, but it's easy to not pay attention to your phone when you're engaged in something else. So, you know, in South Australia some years ago we had the Great Blackout, if you recall that, and some people without power for 3 days. Kids at my school told me it was the best night ever because their parents played games with them. They actually played tic-tac-toe, they played Uno. So I think for some families it's having that time where you actually do something that's enjoyable and the kids feel they're engaged with, because then nobody's, you know, going to be as critical of the phone or screen use because you've actually divvied up your time, that timepiece again. In one of my schools, every day I posed a question for the kids. It was called Buddy Chat, Quick Chat. And I discovered that the kids were taking that question home to mealtime and using that with their families. So I began to publish them openly. So, you know, sometimes you just need a conversation starter. As opposed to, you know, I don't know what to do, so, oh, check my Facebook, whatever. I see it in communities all the time. I see it on buses. I talk to anyone, anywhere, which my daughter tells me makes me a bit of a creeper. However, I do it, but I've never had anyone knock back a conversation, but we just need to have the grit to keep doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all know that we're an incredibly social species, and at the end of the day that there's this wonderful role that digital technology can play, but that we are inherently biologically social, and I think it's merging those worlds together. And something obviously, Jocelyn, that you touched on was the importance of research in this space, making sure that the research is localised, it happens within countries, within communities, and that we're really taking an evidence-based approach that incorporates the views of our important and very insightful young people. So I wanted to very much thank the panel for joining us here today and sharing their both personal and professional insights on this very important topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.